Welcome to True Echo, where real moments meet unforgettable stories. Today, we bring you a powerful tale of honor, humiliation, and a reckoning that shook a nation. What happens when the uniform is invisible, and only the skin is seen? Keep watching, because this is a story you'll never forget. Saturday mornings in Langston's New Virginia suburb were usually quiet. The kind of quiet that whispered of freshly cut lawns and sleepy children dressed for weekend activities. Admiral Christopher Langston wasn't in uniform today. He didn't need to be. At 62, with decades of service, a chest full of medals, and enough security clearances to walk into rooms most people didn't know existed, he'd earned a bit of peace. And today wasn't about duty. It was about family. His daughter Brielle, 11, had her first major piano recital. Dressed in khaki slacks and a navy blue polo with the faint insignia of a retired officer, Chris didn't stand out. He parked his modest black Lexus outside Brookside Performing Arts Center at 9:48 a.m., 15 minutes early. He nodded at a young couple exiting the hall and glanced at his watch. Brielle would be backstage with her teacher now, nervously checking her sheet music. Chris smiled at the thought. He always said the nerves before a performance were good. It meant you cared. But his calm morning was shattered the moment two police cruisers screeched to a halt behind him. Doors flew open. Officers jumped out. One gripped his holster. Another had his hand on a taser. Chris turned slowly, keys still in hand. Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. Chris blinked. Excuse me. Now, one of them barked. For a heartbeat, Chris thought they might be joking. But then he saw the fear in their eyes, real, irrational fear. The kind born from bias, not threat. He raised his hands slowly, keeping eye contact. I think there's a misunderstanding. Gun, one shouted, though Chris was clearly unarmed. Parents across the parking lot pulled their children behind them. A woman gasped. Someone murmured, "What did he do?" Chris didn't resist. He couldn't afford to. Not here. Not with his daughter inside. Not with three shaking hands on triggers. I'm going to kneel, he said calmly. They didn't reply. The gravel was sharp beneath his knees. He winced but kept his posture upright. No sudden moves. His voice was still even. Check my ID. My wallet's in my back pocket. One of the younger officers approached hesitantly, clearly unsure whether to disarm or escalate. He yanked the wallet out. Flipped it open. And froze. The ID glinted in the sun. Navy blue, with a gold eagle and stars. A United States Department of Defense identification card. Active clearance. Rank, Admiral. Name, Christopher J. Langston. Oh my God, the young officer stammered. He's an admiral. The other two officers, still holding weapons on him, hesitated. Slowly, they lowered their arms. The moment was thicker than any apology could fix. Chris didn't move. He looked past the officers, toward the small crowd forming at the edge of the lot. Cell phones were recording. One teenage boy had live-streamed the entire scene. It was already online. Then Chris saw her, Brielle. She had stepped outside in her white recital dress, clutching her sheet music, eyes wide with confusion and fear. She looked at her father, knees on the ground, hands still raised, surrounded by men with guns. And in that moment, something broke. Chris stood slowly. Gravel clung to his skin. Dignity held him upright. He brushed off his knees, locked eyes with his daughter, and gave her a single nod. The officers started talking over each other, trying to explain, to justify. We got a call, suspicious man, near a school. A black man in a nice car near a school, Chris said sharply. That's what this was. We didn't know who you were. And that justifies the guns. He turned to the youngest officer. You thought a man who served his country for 40 years would hurt a child? The officer's lips parted, but no sound came. A local reporter who had shown up to cover the recital had filmed the entire confrontation. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. The footage spoke for itself. The Admiral, the guns, the terrified child. Chris took Brielle's hand gently. "Let's go inside, sweetheart." "But Daddy." "It's okay now," he said, though it wasn't. As they walked toward the hall, the crowd parted. People moved out of the way, not out of fear, but out of respect. The uniform wasn't visible, but everyone could see what these officers hadn't. Inside the concert hall, the tension from the parking lot followed Chris like smoke. Other parents whispered. Some looked away in shame. Others came up with hushed apologies. Chris didn't react. He simply took a seat beside Brielle's teacher, Ms. Conway, who was visibly rattled. "I'm so sorry, Admiral Langston," she whispered. He looked at her. "You shouldn't be. You didn't draw a weapon on me." Brielle sat quietly beside him. Her hands trembled on her lap. When her name was called, she stood slowly, straightened her dress, and made her way to the piano. For a second, it seemed she might falter. Then she began to play. Every note struck like a declaration. Outside, the officers were still processing what had just happened. The department had already received dozens of calls from bystanders. One clip had reached nearly 100,000 views in under an hour. The headline read, "Admiral mistaken for criminal, held at gunpoint outside daughter's recital." By evening, it was national news. Chris declined interviews. At first. But when a retired general called and said, "Chris, you have to speak. You're not just doing it for you," he reconsidered. The next day, Chris stood behind a podium in full dress uniform. A wall of cameras pointed at him. His medals shimmered in the lights. His voice was even, measured, the way it always was during deployments. "I served my country for 4 decades. I've led men and women through war zones, humanitarian crises, and nuclear standoffs. But yesterday, none of that mattered. I wasn't an admiral. I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a man. I was a threat. Because of the color of my skin." Gasps echoed across the press room. "If I didn't have this badge, I might be dead." The press conference wasn't supposed to go viral. But it did. Within 24 hours, clips of Admiral Langston's calm yet devastating words were being shared on every major platform. Celebrities retweeted it. Senators commented. Military leaders issued public statements. Even veterans who'd never spoken out before shared their own stories. Chris hadn't meant to start a movement, but a movement had found him. He received hundreds of messages from servicemen and women, both active and retired, recounting similar experiences. Not all of them had ended with cameras and press conferences. Some ended with blood. Some with trauma. Some with silence. And that, Chris realized, was the real danger, the silence. At home, things weren't quiet either. Brielle was still shaken. She'd begun having trouble sleeping. Chris found her once in the middle of the night sitting on the stairs, clutching her recital sheet music. "They didn't even see you," she whispered. "They just saw what they wanted." Chris sat down beside her. "People are afraid of what they don't understand. But we're not here to make them comfortable. We're here to make them better." "Are they going to be punished?" she asked. Chris hesitated. "That's not my call. But they're being investigated." In fact, the investigation had already begun. The 3 officers involved were placed on administrative leave. The local police chief, an older man who hadn't expected his sleepy town to become the center of national controversy, issued a weak apology on local television. "We are reviewing protocols," he said, "and addressing community concerns." But the public wasn't satisfied with protocols. They wanted accountability. And the Department of Justice was listening. A week later, Chris received an unexpected visitor. Special Counsel Elena Graves, lead attorney from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, requested a private meeting at his home. She arrived alone, dressed in a tailored navy suit, a single legal pad in her hand. After formal introductions, they sat in the living room where photos of Chris's naval career lined the walls, shaking hands with presidents, standing on carrier decks, medals being pinned to his chest. Elena glanced at the wall. They had no idea who they were putting in handcuffs. Chris smiled grimly. That's the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. You're right, she said, folding her hands. And that's why we're opening a federal investigation, not just into the incident, but into broader patterns of racial profiling within the department. Chris raised an eyebrow. So this isn't just about me. It never was. You were the spark. But we've had 6 complaints in the last 3 years from this department. All buried. Yours was caught on video. Chris nodded slowly. So what happens now? Elena paused. We're forming a task force. It's part oversight, part reform. The Attorney General would like you to lead it. Chris blinked. You want me back in uniform? Not in uniform. In command. Chris didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, watching the wind move through the trees. It had been barely a week since the incident, since being forced to his knees in front of his daughter, and now the Department of Justice wanted him to return, not to the Navy, but to lead a task force on racial accountability in law enforcement. It was an honor, yes. But it was also a burden. I'm not sure I'm the right man for this, Chris finally said. Elena leaned forward. You're exactly the right man. Not just because of what happened to you, but because of how you handled it. Calm, composed, dignified. People are listening because you didn't lash out. You spoke truth with clarity. That's rare. Chris sighed. I joined the Navy at 18. I followed orders, gave orders, protected people who didn't always look like me or believe what I believed. And in all that time, no one ever put a gun in my face, until I came home. Elena was quiet. She understood. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a personal reckoning. After a long pause, Chris stood. I'll do it. But on one condition. What's that? I don't want a symbolic post. I want teeth. Authority. Resources. If I'm going to clean up a mess, I won't do it with a mop, I need firepower. You'll have it, she said without blinking. The next week, the White House announced the creation of the National Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force, chaired by retired Admiral Christopher Langston. News coverage exploded. Some hailed him a patriot. Others called it political theater. But Chris didn't care. He wasn't in it for headlines. He was in it for Brielle. Back in Virginia, the 3 officers involved were now under federal review. One had already resigned. Another had hired a private lawyer. The youngest, Officer Daniel Whitman, sent Chris a handwritten letter. It read, Admiral Langston. I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know, I didn't see you. Not really. And that's the problem. I joined the force to serve, not to profile. But that day, I failed you. I failed your daughter. I failed myself. I'm sorry. I'm willing to testify, to cooperate, to do anything to make this right. D. Whitman. Chris folded the letter gently. He didn't reply, but he didn't destroy it either. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The town's mayor was caught on a hot mic calling the incident an overreaction. Local elections suddenly had a new focal point. And Brielle? She was invited to perform at a youth peace concert in Washington, D.C. Chris sat front row in a suit this time, watching her small hands glide across the keys. She wasn't nervous now. She was strong. She was his daughter. And she was watching him change the country in real time. The Washington concert ended with a standing ovation, not just for Brielle's piano brilliance but for what her presence now symbolized, a young black girl whose father stood before guns, stood before cameras, and now stood before Congress. In the weeks that followed, Admiral Christopher Langston became a figure many didn't expect, a disciplined warrior-turned-activist, unafraid to look senators, governors, and chiefs of police in the eye and tell them what needed to change. "I'm not asking you to like the conversation," he said during a congressional hearing. "I'm asking you to have it. Because if the sight of my daughter watching me kneel in gravel didn't move you, then maybe you're not fit to wear the badge, or hold the gavel." Some applauded. Some scoffed. But no one ignored him. Chris traveled from state to state, meeting with police departments, reviewing body cam footage, overseeing new training policies. The task force wasn't just advisory, it had been granted emergency federal power to audit departments and suspend funding based on civil rights violations. And he used it. By the third month, 5 departments were under formal review. 2 had their funding frozen. Meanwhile, his quiet town in Virginia faced its own reckoning. The officer who wrote the letter, Daniel Whitman, came forward publicly. He testified in a town hall meeting, eyes downcast, voice shaking. "I saw what I was trained to fear," he admitted. "Not what was there. I saw Black, not Admiral. And I don't deserve a badge until I fix that." It was raw. Vulnerable. And it shifted the tone. Chris was there. He stood at the back, arms folded. When the meeting ended, Daniel approached him. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," the young man mumbled. Chris looked at him steadily. "You said the right thing. Now keep walking the path." But not all reactions were positive. Threats began to pour in. Letters. Emails. Even a rock thrown through Chris's home office window late one night. The words painted on the stone said, "Stay silent." Chris didn't flinch. He had faced pirates in the Gulf, nuclear standoffs in the Pacific, and classified crises the public would never know about. A coward with a rock didn't scare him. Still, he moved Brielle and his wife, Lila, to a secure location temporarily. "Just until this settles," he told them. "You mean until they settle," Lila corrected gently. Chris nodded. "Yes." The DOJ increased his security. And yet, Chris refused to back down. He returned to the school where the incident happened for a public community forum, packed wall to wall with locals, media, and officers from neighboring counties. He stood at the podium, the same man who had once knelt on gravel. "You don't need to be an admiral to deserve respect," he said. "You don't need a title to deserve dignity. But you do need to know, this ends now. Not just for me. For every person who looks like me and was never seen until it was too late." Silence filled the room. Then applause. Then people stood. Even the new interim police chief stood, his hand on his heart. Change was coming. 3 months after the incident, Admiral Christopher Langston stood once again in front of the Brookside Performing Arts Center. This time, there were no squad cars, no raised weapons, no trembling hands mistaking skin for threat. The same gravel that once bit into his knees now crunched beneath the boots of news crews and civilians gathering for a different reason, dedication. A bronze plaque had been installed at the entrance. In honor of justice, courage, and dignity. On this site, Admiral Christopher J. Langston reminded America who we are, and who we must become. Brielle stood next to him, holding his hand. Dressed in white again, this time by choice, she looked out at the crowd with confidence. The story had traveled the world. Chris had been interviewed on 60 Minutes. His congressional testimony had been replayed during national debates. Policies had already begun to shift, body cam accountability laws were passed in 2 states as a direct result of the DOJ task force's reports. But this moment, this plaque, this recital hall, meant more to him than anything Washington could offer. It was where his dignity had been bruised, but not broken. Where his daughter saw him humiliated, but later watched him rise. In the crowd were both strangers and familiar faces. Officer Daniel Whitman stood quietly in the second row, now working in youth outreach. No longer on patrol. He had requested the change himself. When asked why, he simply said, "I'm trying to fix what I helped break." Chris approached the podium one last time. No script. No speechwriters. "I knelt on gravel that day because I had no choice," he began, voice calm. "But I rose because I had every reason. Not just for myself. For every person who has ever been told they didn't belong. For every veteran mistaken for a criminal. For every black father seen as a threat instead of a protector." He paused, scanning the crowd. Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. And progress doesn't erase pain. But we move forward anyway, because standing still is the most dangerous thing we can do. Brielle squeezed his hand. And together, they stepped away from the podium, father and daughter, legacy and future. Admiral Christopher Langston's story reminds us that even the most decorated among us can still be mistaken, and mistreated. But what defines a man is not what is done to him, it's what he does after. As Admiral Langston once said, "If I didn't have this badge, I might be dead." That should terrify you more than it terrifies me. Let this story be a mirror. A challenge. A reckoning. If this story moved you, subscribe to True Echo for more real, inspirational, and powerful narratives. Comment your city below and tell us, what would you do if it happened in your town? Share this video to be part of the conversation, and the change.